Fáilte a Cháirte Gael. This is episode 71 of the Rebel Matters podcast and the 11th episode of the show ever since the pandemic started and we've been in lockdown. Things seem to be easing up now this week and hopefully that'll continue in the coming weeks. And I hope you're all keeping as well as possible given the circumstances that we find ourselves in. This week's guest on the show is Áine O Gorman, who's involved in several different aspects of climate change and environmental activism. I really enjoyed being a part of this episode because I got to ask Áine loads of questions and I'm really curious about climate change and where we're going with the environment. And I came to the table very much as a novice in terms of the information that I had and had loads of questions that I've had for a long time. And Áine did a really good job of breaking those down and making them as understandable as possible. And I was actually buzzing after we had the conversation here because things just seemed to make more sense. We talked about the big picture and the environment on a global level. We went down to national level, local issues, and all the way down to what we can do as individuals to help with like making positive climate change and not just making sustainable choices when we're in the shopping centre, but what we can do as individuals to impact bigger change as well. Change on a grander scale, I suppose, and the importance of people coming together. And we also talked about Áine's involvement in the fashion industry and how that impacts the environment and climate change as well. This is definitely a really important episode to have done, and I would like to do more along these lines. And I think it's good timing also because most of us have got more time to learn about things like the climate and the environment and the big things that are happening at the minute on a global scale and a national scale and what actions we can take individually to help make like the world last longer so we don't go extinct. It's probably safe to say that it doesn't get really more important than that. So before we get stuck into the show, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has been supporting the podcast on Patreon. We hit 33 patrons this week, which is 1/3 of the way to the target of 100 patrons. So Gurached Mila Maiga of Cháirte Gael. If you want to become a patron of the show, then you can go to patreon.com/Rebel Matters, and there's 3 different tiers there that are named after 3 of my favourite trees. And you can pick one and support the podcast for as little or as many months as you feel like. Patreon, it's kind of like a form of socialism because the project is funded by the people who listen to the podcast, and I'll keep making the podcast for as long as you're enjoying them and for as long as I'm enjoying making them and for as long as the lovely guests are happy to come on and share their stories. And that's the way it works, which is pretty cool. As usual, at the very end of the episode, after the outro music, there is a chapter of me reading a book, and the book that we're reading at the minute is Charles McGlinchey's The Last of the Name. Charles McGlinchey lived in Mincha Glen in Donegal between 1861 and 1854, and the book is kind of his recollections of his life and stories that have been passed on to him by his parents and his grandparents about what life was like in and around that area at the time. It's a really nice window into a time gone by and also a very nice record of how life changed over the course of that 100 years or so up there. And if you want to hear the very first chapter of that book, you can go back to the end of episode 67. So chapter 6 is at the end of this episode. Let's get stuck into this conversation anyway, and I just want to say a massive thank you to Áine for being a guest on the show, and thanks to all of you for listening, and keep her lit. Buen salt.
I've been involved in environmental activism for maybe 8 years now. And I started that in university, and I was quite involved. And then now I'm involved I work for Friends of the Earth, and I help coordinate the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition. And within that, my role is activism support officer. So that means that I try and work with grassroots to see how we can support them with our resources, and how we can amplify their asks. And also when we have things that we're trying to achieve, if we, also that we have a relationship with them, so we can give our policy expertise to grassroots activists if that's helpful. On the other side, then I also have a part-time job as a model, and so I'm also involved in a group called Model Activist, and that's about just looking at the world we live in the fashion industry and how looking towards a more sustainable world in fashion industry as well. So yeah.
How did you end up getting involved in things to do with the climate change and stuff in the first place?
It's a funny story. Well, I suppose when I was younger, I would have not really cared that much. Like, I grew up in the middle of the countryside in Tipperary. So I grew up under mountains, like in this tiny village. And so I've always been really, really into nature. Like, I've always just spent my whole childhood running around nature. So that kind of like preservation of nature and preservation of the earth, and also like the mental health benefits from being out in nature are like ingrained in me. And then it was actually, I kind of ended up looking at like climate change when I was modeling, and I was in New York, and I was doing Fashion Week, and I remember just seeing these like enormous sets being built for like these like 40-minute shows, and then them just like taking them down, throwing everything in the bin, and just sitting there and being like, what is going on here? And I remember one day I saw them take a whole set down and then throw like a whole bin, a physical bin, into a skip. And I was like, what is this like mass amounts of waste? Like, this is crazy. And then I just started researching waste, and then I got into like food waste, and then I saw how food waste is really connected to climate change and emissions. And then I went to college after that, and I got really involved in the environmental society there, and then got really involved in a fossil fuel divestment campaign. And so I suppose my journey quite quickly moved from like individual actions that we all need to take to, let's all like make sure that we don't throw bins in the bin, and let's sure that we don't all, don't food waste, to looking at it from a more systemic perspective, and a more system change perspective quite quickly.
It's funny,
but yeah, that's it.
Hearing you talking about taking the sets down, because it just popped into my head there when you were talking about that. There is, my dad has been involved in the theatre like for, I suppose, most of his life now, like, which kind of by default meant that we were involved in it when we were kids. Mm-hmm. But I remember helping. There was one guy who was in charge of putting the sets up and taking the sets down, but they must have been using the same pieces of wood for about 15 years, or like unscrewing them all, putting them in the storage, then bring it out the next year and build a completely different set with the same stuff.
But I mean, that's the thing, and that's a lot of the stuff that we talk about is like, there's this narrative that happens where it's like, well, if you don't want us to, you want to stop art, and you want to like make things harder for people. And you're like, no, like you're able to reuse stuff. You're just this, and I think it's a good narrative for like this system and that we're in that's causing the climate breakdown, is that like we're so ingrained in this thing, like we have to make new stuff and reuse, like not reuse it and like throw it in the bin, and like people don't even think of that. But actually, yeah, like you can reuse the same planks of wood for 15 years. Absolutely. Why not? We just need a storage space for them. So yeah, like I think it's like a really nice little like story, like those two stories actually, about what this issue is.
So Stop Climate Chaos, is that your main job? Is that like your full-time job?
Yeah.
And what is Stop Climate Chaos? Is it funded by the government or something, or?
So Stop Climate Chaos is a coalition of organisations. So I think it's now 15 years old. And essentially it's a coalition of organisations across the spectrum. So from like Troca are involved, Concern are involved. It's a coalition of development organisations and environmentally focused organisations coming together, because I suppose, especially 15 years ago, the narrative around climate change was not listened to at all. But also, developing countries in the global south are where climate change is already hitting really hard. And so it's so important to have those voices at the forefront when we talk about climate action. And so Stop Climate Chaos really tries to bring in as many different voices from as many different civil society organizations as possible to then make proposals to government to coordinate actions. But it's trying to make sure that the language we use and the narratives that we talk about are grounded in a lot of like climate justice, which is really talking about who's most affected. How do we help and support those who are most affected first?
And like in the last couple of years, the climate change conversation really has kind of come to the fore, hasn't it? One of the things that whenever, I guess just in general, of just kind of trying to listen to the conversation and be a part of it, there's a lot of voices there and a lot of different stories, which is kind of one of the reasons that I was really interested for us to do the podcast together, because I wanted to kind of speak to someone who would say, okay, look, according to the coalition that I'm a part of, this is how we see the state of play at the minute. And so have you guys kind of got that kind of analysis that you just kind of share with people?
I mean, do you mean the state of play in Ireland, the state of play globally?
Well, I guess let's start globally first anyway. And see.
Okay, we can give it a go. I suppose overarchingly what we always say, which is what, I'm sure many of your listeners, and you'll know Greta Thunberg, who's the founder of Fridays for Future, is this mantra of unite behind the science. So there is science there. There was an IPCC report that came out 2 years ago, the International IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change. Anyway, it's a UN body. God, I really should know that. And that report basically was looking at how long do we have before we reach like irreversible tipping points. Now, we're already reaching irreversible tipping points on climate change, but that report really like grounded for the first time in scientific certainty that if we don't reduce our emissions globally by like more than 50% by 2030, we're heading for a 2 degrees level of warming. And we're currently at 1 degree level of warming, and we're already seeing lots of like knock-on effects across the world. So we're seeing more droughts. We're seeing, even in Ireland, we're seeing more storms. Weather is getting more frequent and more intense, like big weather systems. And so I suppose one of the key things is this idea of uniting behind the science and going, this is how much we need to reduce emissions by, and we have to do it because that's what science says. One of the things that we've been kind of looking at recently is this, like how we've reacted to the coronavirus and how we've listened to scientists and how we've really, governments, for the main part, have listened to the scientists and gone, okay, we're listening to you now, and this is what we're going to do. And that hasn't been the case for climate change. And we're already seeing the knock-on effects of climate change. I mean, I was at the UN last July, and I met a girl from the Marshall Islands, and she was like, look, I wake up in the mornings sometimes having nightmares of my island being submerged in water. And, the place where my grandmother used to go to swim on the beach is not there anymore. And I think in Ireland, you hear those stories a lot. I mean, I remember hearing those stories as a kid, but it's really, really affecting people. It is true. It is happening. We're seeing migration. We're seeing so many climate-related issues. And the key thing that we're talking about is this, we have to get governments to listen to the science and actually take actions to reduce emissions in line with that. Now, on the other side of that is the social equity part. And you've got kind of two big key issues. You've got global equity and you've got national equity. And nationally, we have to look at, well, what is going to happen to people who work in those jobs, which are currently, focused on fossil fuels. So the peat workers in Bord na Móna is a big one. And some of the issues behind that is because governments haven't, 10 years ago, in Ireland, there was a proposal that went to the government that said, we need to think about Bord na Móna workers now. They're going to, because this is what the science is saying 10 years ago, they are going to have to move away from fossil fuels. We're going to have to give them other opportunities. And government didn't do that. And that's happening globally. where governments haven't taken action fast enough to think about what is going to happen to workers as we are forced to take the transition. And so that's one of the kind of national questions, is like, how do we do this in a just and equitable way? How do we make sure that when that people's homes are warmer, so their fuel prices aren't super high as carbon taxes come onto them? How do we make retrofitting programs affordable to everyone? How do we make sure that social housing is retrofitted? So that's the national question. And then the international question is, it's a massive one of equity, where, we have a global carbon budget. So that means that globally, we have to reduce emissions by 2030 by 7.6% over what we are at the moment. But there's like this idea of fair share. So because we're in a country, and a lot of global north countries would fall into this, we're in a country that has polluted a lot over the last few years. And we're in a country that's rapidly industrialized, and we're in a global north well-developed country. There are some countries who need to develop, but we're saying to them, no, you cannot develop with fossil fuels. You have to start developing your renewable energy. You have to start being energy efficient. And the only way that they are going to be able to do that is if we pay them, is if we actually physically give them the money. And that's this idea of climate finance and fair share. So it means that we have to reduce our emissions faster than other countries. And also we have to put into this pot of climate finance, which is coordinated by the UN, to say, you know what, we recognize that you need to move away faster, and you're also trying to develop your economy, develop your jobs. And so we have to pay them. We have to pay them to develop renewable energy. And that's difficult, And I'm not a climate science expert or a climate finance expert. But it's one of the biggest nitty-gritty things that people are going to have to drill down to. But those are kind of the three equity things that we have to look at.
So do you guys kind of look at an international level and also on a more national kind of front?
So I suppose we mostly work on a national perspective. We often work at an EU level. We would input to like EU or position papers that are going to the EU from like a coalition of European climate NGOs. But then we have members in the Stop Climate Coalition who work in the global South countries. So they would be very much looking at it from an international perspective. And then we often send people to COP, which is the Conference of the Parties, which is the massive UN meeting that happens every year on climate change. And at that level, many of our members would be advocating for climate finance and international action. But one of our big things is looking at, like, we need to reduce our emissions faster than many other countries. And that's already an international question.
That was the next question I was going to ask you. So you mentioned the fact that for a successful kind of transition to more sustainable energy sources and stuff like that workers are going to have to transition over to other ways of making a living and move away from fossil fuels. What are the other main issues that we're currently facing in Ireland with regards to climate change?
I mean, at the moment, like, that's one of the big ones. I think the increased amount of like extreme weather that we've seen over the last few years with Storm Ophelia, with the snow, we've seen an increasing amount of extreme weather. It also looks like this summer is going to be pretty hot again. And that's, I mean, we can see that already affecting farmers. We had a drought 2 years ago that was hugely affected farmers. And the thing about climate change or climate breakdown is that it's the increased frequency of these events. So lots of people say, sure, we had a drought in, 86. And like, yes, we did have a drought in 86, but we didn't have a storm followed by a massive snow, followed by a drought, followed by, it's that increased frequency. And we've already seen that there's, I don't know how much money has had to be spent on regenerating Donegal after the huge storm. There's the farmers, people along the coast are being affected. So there's those like very practical things. And then the big one is, the EU are going to come down on us with fines, for not reaching our targets. And that's going to be tough on us. So we've got that kind of like incentive to, and there's a reason that they're going to come down on us with fines, because we haven't reduced our emissions the way we said we would. So that's a taxpayer issue. And then there's just things like, like I was saying earlier about like warmer homes. And, if fuel prices are probably going to increase if we stay on fossil fuels. So how do we support people to actually move off fossil fuels? One of the big things that I know Friends of the Earth are looking at is this idea of community energy. So the idea that communities should own their own energy, or their own renewable energy. So you could have solar panels on a school, and during the summer months, those solar panels, the school isn't using the energy from the solar panels. So the community actually owns that energy and can use it within the community, which makes it much cheaper and much more affordable. And it's quite like a justice focused way of looking at how we use our energy. The sun is everyone's. So and the wind is everyone's. So how do we make sure that energy is taken out of the hands of big corporations and put into the hands of communities?
As far as the extreme weather events that we've been experiencing over the last number of years, so it's definitive, like that those extreme weather events are happening because of a negative change in the climate and the environment, aren't they? Is that standard? Like everyone should understand that on a very base level. That's why these things are happening.
So what I'm going to say is I am not a climate scientist, and I also know that there is a certain amount of time that we have to wait after a series of extreme weather events before they can look back. Climate scientists and meteorologists can look back and say, yes, that was caused by climate change. I would really, really recommend looking up videos by Professor John Sweeney, because he goes through these things really well. But what I can say is that they are increased, and that is one of the indicators of climate breakdown is there is an increase in the frequency of extreme weather. And we have certainly seen an increase in the frequency of extreme weather. So, Met Éireann, I think during storms and stuff, Met Éireann actually often come out and they say, look, we can't say that this is climate change. And they would have. But the reason is that scientists never want to say something and it not to be true. And especially with climate change, because there's so much climate denial that if they say something, the climate deniers will be out there ready to get them. But it is certainly true that we have had an increase in the frequency of extreme weather over the last few years across the world. And it's certainly true that is an indicator of climate breakdown. So take from that.
Also, though, whenever I'm thinking about those things, I'm like, well, I mean, let's just say that you take the gamble and say that it's not because of climate change. Like, if you're wrong, then we're all going to be dead. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Let's imagine that it is. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose that you could kind of relate it to and I'm being very careful here to not say that lots of people are suffering right now with coronavirus, and there's we're being very careful about not to equate the climate breakdown and coronavirus, even though the climate crisis is a huge crisis as well. But this is very immediate for people. But, imagine if the government had said, well, yeah, there's a few people sick, sure. And we can see that it's spreading, sure. And we can see that and we know that these are indicators, and we know that a cough and a fever is an indicator of coronavirus, but we're not 100% sure that it's going to, be that bad in our country yet. So let's just wait it out. We don't really want to, we've seen what happens when governments say they don't really want to close down the economy, and they don't really want to, have these big impacts because we're not sure what's going to happen. So it's the same thing, exactly what you're saying with climate change. We might as well take it seriously and do our best to stop it, or at least mitigate for it, and put protection in place for people. And that's the key thing, accept that this is real, and let's put protection in place for people, and let's do our best to try and mitigate for this, and adapt our country and adapt our world so as we can deal with this in a just way.
I kind of get the sense that the whole debate and conversation around climate change is one that it's kind of littered with, like you say, like governments or people who are in positions of authority are often afraid to say something real definitive. So there's a lot of information out there, and really a large part of the responsibility is kind of falling back on individual citizens or groups of independent people, and that's kind of what we're after seeing with like the Extinction Rebellion and with the whole movement that built around kind of Greta Thunberg's thing. That was kind of like they're school kids that are taking kind of the responsibility and taking the fight to the street as such.
Yeah.
The thing that you mentioned at the very beginning, which I'm really interested to ask you about, was you mentioned that kind of made the comparison between how there's been a really immediate reaction to the coronavirus pretty much when you compare it to the reactions that we've seen to climate change and stuff like that. Why do you think that is?
Because it's an immediate threat, definitely. I mean, climate change is nebulous. You know, climate change is this big issue in the sky that, especially in Ireland, we haven't seen that much of. It's very hard to see how it affects you personally at this moment. You know, I will like there's days I go out and I'm like, do you know what? I'm not going to recycle my cup, and I'm very pro systemic change, not necessarily individual change. But there's some days you're like, do you know what? I'm just going to go and have a good time today. You know, I'm not going to think about climate change. Whereas coronavirus is it's here and it's affecting, like, everyone knows someone who's being affected by it, and also, you know, it's real. Like, we've seen the pictures, like we've seen how it can decimate, like Italy, we've seen how it can decimate whole countries and people, and it's really like it's affecting people. And I think that's why we've seen this massive reaction to coronavirus, and that's totally valid. And I think climate change is a harder thing to grasp. And also, when you do grasp climate change, it can be very overwhelming. And that's what we've often seen is some people get climate change and they just shut down. Like, it's so big. It's such a massive issue. It's existential at a level even above coronavirus. And that's really hard to deal with. And then I also think there's the issue with governments because it's so large and because people don't react to it in the same way as they have to this like issue where I actually physically might get sick. My loved ones actually physically might get sick today or tomorrow. Like, governments don't want to have the potential that they're going to lose votes. They're going to slow down, you know, they're going to have to make difficult choices. They don't want to have to do that. They want to continue, you know, people being happy, thinking that their country is safe, thinking that everything is generally okay. And once you start accepting climate change, it's quite difficult to do that. Now, I just want to caveat this with, on the other hand, our perspective is a lot of the things that you could do to mitigate for climate change would actually make, you know, life easier and better for people, like warmer homes and community energy and these kind of things I was talking about earlier. But governments don't want to have to make those difficult decisions, and they're scared to. But it's easy because for a lot of voters, up until like the last couple of years especially, it's not top of their priority list, and it's too big and too nebulous. So yeah.
Do you think that there's a resistance to bringing in like really meaningful change with regards to our greenhouse gas emissions and stuff like that there, because of the fact that there's so many very powerful business interests vested in the fossil fuels and in keeping things the way they are?
Yes, absolutely. Like 100%. You know, like one of the big fights that the environmental movement in Ireland has at the moment is in Kerry against an LNG terminal. So what LNG is it's liquefied natural gas, and that's gas that has been fracked in the US. And fracking involves drilling into the bedrock and releasing out gas and capturing that gas. And it's really, really damaging for a community. So damaging that actually in Ireland we banned it. So there was supposed to be fracking in Leitrim, and we banned it because every party said, no, it's too dangerous. But in the US, they're drilling away gung-ho. So it's very dangerous for those communities. And then it gets brought across in huge tankers. It's liquefied, brought in huge tankers across the ocean. And they want to build a terminal in Kerry off the Shannon, and one in Cork, where the gas would come in, be deliquefied and turned into gas, and then pumped to Europe. So we would be kind of like a hub for new fossil fuel infrastructure for Europe, which is crazy. And that would not be, it's locking us into gas, which is like, we just can't do that. We don't have enough carbon budget. We have to be moving to renewable energies. But to answer your question, one of the big things, and I come from a rural area, and I completely appreciate that rural Ireland is decimated and rural Ireland needs opportunities. But the lobbying that has been done in that area by the big fossil fuel interests to tell the local community that there's going to be so many jobs in this and it's going to be so good for the local community is insane. And it's, it's not fair. But that also means that at government level, we see that the Fine Gael in the last government pushed through planning for this in quite an undemocratic way. And we see that time and time again with the fossil fuel industry and different things that get passed through governments, like offshore oil exploration, different things that just, they passed a climate emergency, and I think it was 2 days later they gave out drilling for oil licenses. And it just doesn't make any sense. It's
really similar to the thing that was happening up in Rossport with the Shell to Sea campaign, that kind of went ahead, and that was a massive lobby from Shell as well, wasn't it?
Yeah. And we know, globally, we know that the big fossil fuel companies are just, they just have so much lobbying power. They're just incredibly good at lobbying. And I mean, I don't have the numbers off my head, but there are the numbers out there, which just shows how much they spend on lobbying and how much lobbying they do. So yeah, the fossil fuel lobbying interest is just enormous, and they have no interest in going under. They don't want to go under. Their business model is to drill and drill and drill as much as they can out of the soil, out of the earth, and they don't want to go under. And if you're a businessman, that makes sense. If you care about the environment, that makes no sense. But yeah, they're going to have to go out of business.
That thing that you're talking about down off the coast of Kerry, that's the first time that I've heard of that, which probably is kind of representative of the power of the lobby in the first place, that hasn't become a national story as such.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because it's probably the biggest thing that the Irish climate movement has mobilised around since probably Shell to Sea. And now I wasn't around during Shell to Sea, so I'm not the best person to talk about that at all. But this LNG it's such a symbol. I think it's a great symbol of that issue of climate justice that I was talking about earlier, because what it is Irish people in Ireland saying, no, we do not want to have this. We don't want to have this fossil fuel infrastructure on our island. We do not think that we should be building anything that that allows more fossil fuels to be transported, allows more fossil fuels to be used, which is what that would do. But the other thing it says is we also don't want communities in Texas, communities in Philadelphia in the US to be drilled like this. Fracking causes earthquakes. I'd really recommend watch it. If you look up fracking water fire, if you see communities in the US, they can set fire to their water because there's so much gas in it, or they turn on their taps and so much methane comes out of their taps that they can set fire to it. So it's really interesting, because for the Irish environmental movement, it is such a big battle, and we're winning it. We really are. But it is a big battle, and it's a tough one because you're consistently up against these just massive corporations who are just trying their hardest to get this over the line. Yeah.
Something that you've mentioned a couple of times and kind of alluded to again there is the enormity of the battle that has to be fought to kind of make positive change, really. And what is a way that people can engage with that kind of struggle, people who might not necessarily be involved in the climate change movement per se, whether in their careers or anything like that, where they're just but they're interested in it and want to get involved in it? How can people do that?
So I suppose there's a few things. One of the things is if you have any local climate groups in your area, I would say get involved. Like for me, like there's Extinction Rebellion groups across the country. If you're young, there's Fridays for Future groups across the country. That's the school strikers. And then often in local areas, if there's a local issue, so like in Leitrim, there's groups, in Kerry, there's groups, in Clare, there's groups, because those groups are fighting these specific site battle issues. And I would say, go get involved in them. One of my favorite groups is actually a group in Dublin called Dundrum Climate Vigil. And they're a group of retired people who said, you know what we're going to do? We're retired, but we really want to support the school strikers. And the school strikers, for anyone who doesn't know, leave school every Friday and go on strike because they say my future is worth more than my education, and what's education on a dead planet. So these group of retired people go out every single Friday outside their church in Dundrum, and then often they go down to support the school strikers outside the Dáil. And they also say, look, we're here in solidarity with the school strikers. That's really nice. If you can't join a local group, what I've been running for the last few weeks is these kind of like call your TD events. So what we're trying to do is two things. We're trying to show TDs that climate is a big issue for their constituents. So TDs are very susceptible to what they think their constituents want. If they think their constituents don't care about an issue, they're less likely to vote on an issue in the Dáil or to advocate for an issue in the Dáil. So what we've been trying to do is say, come on a Zoom call with us and call your TD with us. And we're there. We've got support for you. We've got some expert policy people, and you call your TD and you tell them, even if you just say, I really care about climate change. I really want you to advocate about climate change. I don't actually know that much about it, but I'm afraid. That is extremely powerful when politicians are talking in the Dáil. So we've been organising things like that. And I think that's a good entry point where you both learn some of the science and you learn some of the issues. You're taking a little bit of action, but it's not too much time out of your day. And it is pretty impactful if you believe that change comes from inside the Dáil.
How can people get on those calls if they want to do that?
If you follow, you can sign up to the Stop Climate Chaos mailing list, so www.stopclimatechaos.ie, or if you follow Stop Climate Chaos on any social media, we always put out social media and send emails about when those calls are happening.
Well, the thing that I think is an important thing for people to realise as well is that those kind of grassroots movements do affect real change. Like, I think the biggest danger is if you're sitting at home thinking, there's nothing I can do. If they want to drill off that coast, they're going to just do it anyway. So I'm not going to waste my time getting involved in this campaign. It's like, it does affect change, and it's happened in the past where we've stopped stuff like that.
Oh my God, absolutely. Like this campaign, particularly around LNG, around drilling off the Irish coast, like that, we have stopped that. LNG is frozen at the moment. I mean, these companies are scrabbling to try and get planning permission, to try. What's happening now is the company that we're trying to build the LNG terminal have been stopped so many times that they actually pulled out, and they're looking for another company to buy the rights to do that. Like, it's so effective. The fracking ban in Ireland, which has had an impact on everyone in Ireland. Like I said, fracking causes tiny earthquakes. We don't have earthquakes in Ireland. So the fracking ban in Ireland came from the grassroots. Like, the fracking ban came from groups of individuals in Leitrim who said, no, we are not having this. It didn't come, so joining a grassroots movement is so impactful. The other thing I would say is, from I'm working with people who've been, working on policy for years and years and years, and they would say that suddenly, because of Fridays for Future, because Schools Climate Action Network, Extinction Rebellion, those big groups who've suddenly bounced up and done these mass protests, the ability for, politicians are really, really, really listening to us now. And actually what it's meant is that when organizations like ours used to get 2 seconds on the radio, we'd just say, someone listen to us, climate change, someone listen to us. And now what we're able to say is we get 5 minutes on the radio. And now what we're able to say is climate change, but let's do climate change in a socially just way. We're able to be a bit more nuanced. We're able to like really fight for the world that we want to see, not just, will someone, God's sake, listen to us, the world is burning, you know. So grassroots movements for me, like my job is to work with grassroots movements, and like that's where I believe the change comes from. So yeah, if you can get involved in the grassroots, it's also great crack to be involved in the grassroots movement. Like, go do it. It's the best crack ever. It's where you make your great friends and everyone. Yeah, honestly.
See, when I think about the various kind of grassroots campaigns in Ireland that I'm aware of over the last number of years, you mentioned the Frecken in Leitrim, and Leitrim is the least populated county in Ireland. So, yeah. And you could probably say the same thing for a lot of the other campaigns, that it starts with a small group of people who are most immediately affected. Yeah. But at the same time, when I'm thinking about the things like climate change and the environment, is, I mean, if you look at Ireland, is it a pebble in the Atlantic Ocean? If it's going to affect people in Leitrim, it's going to affect the people in Cork and in Belfast. Yeah, sooner or later, and the time. Yeah. This is really the time to acknowledge that fact. And if there's something happening down in Kerry, then it's still very important that people that outside of Kerry get involved in a campaign like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think a nice example of that is there's a group in Dublin called Not Here, Not Anywhere, and they are based in Dublin. Everyone lives in Dublin, but their whole concept of their activist group is that they're saying no new fossil fuel infrastructure anywhere in Ireland. So they will roll in behind, and they do a lot of the really kind of like hardcore nitty-gritty work of like writing policy papers, writing to politicians, you know, organizing protests outside the Dáil. And it means that the people who are on the ground, you know, are doing that hard work on the ground, but then they also have support from this group in Dublin. And that's so powerful to just see people across the country working together. Like there's something that's going to become quite big in the next while is there's a fracking license in Fermanagh, and that's something, you know, it's, you know, just across the border, and it's going to, like, if they're fracking in Fermanagh, it's going to affect the people in Leitrim, you know, it's going to affect the people. So that's something that we're looking at as well, and that Not Here, Not Anywhere and like other groups are looking at. And there's like the group in Kerry support the group in Fermanagh. And they share resources and they help each other, because we know that, and you can expand that as well. You know, if there's fracking in Fermanagh, that means that there's more fossil fuels everywhere. So it also is going to affect that poor girl in the Marshall Islands, because once that stuff is in the air, you know, it's affecting the whole world.
Are environmental issues dealt with in Ireland on a whole island basis, or is it separated from the north and south?
It's separate, and that's kind of crazy. I remember talking to someone once who was like, look at the River Shannon. You know, there was a big, I think, gold mine being in there. There was a big gold mine anyway in the north being proposed, and people were saying, look, if there's cyanide falls into the Shannon in the north, that cyanide is going out of the sea in Limerick and in Clare, you know, and that's coming all the way down through the whole country. Environmental issues do not see borders. So yeah, it's that kind of whole island approach to environmental issues is important and also exceedingly difficult. But that's where grassroots groups are so powerful and so important, because we really see that.
As you're saying, that it's easier for grassroots organisations to work across the whole country.
Yeah.
The conversation about climate change, if you know, I think is it fair to say that you could get engaged with the conversation about climate change and kind of maybe not have as much exposure to the big issues that we're talking about and the national and international campaigns and issues as well, and end up being funneled down a road of like using a Keep Cup and stuff like that. And I wanted to ask you about how those two things balance, because like we talked about the business interests that are so against change that is going to have a positive impact on the climate, but then in the last, say, 10 years, there's a massive industry after being created around sort of greener alternatives like keep cups and reusable bags and all that kind of stuff. And I just wanted to ask you about like how those two things kind of balance off against each other, the focus on the bigger pictures and also the kind of personal responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really, really important to note because like I'll put my hands up and say when I started in environment, like when I kind of started my journey into climate action, I was full on, you know, completely into I have to have my keep cup and I have to like be as zero waste as possible and I have to, you know, try to recycle every single thing. And let me tell you, if you try and do that as much as possible, that is exhausting. It is exhausting. And it also, I found it almost quite depressing because you're doing your best and it is hard because one of my colleagues has this thing where she says the rules are wrong. Like the rules in our country, the rules in our societies are not there to help you be environmentally friendly. Like they're not there. So you're consistently fighting. You go to you go to Tesco's and you say, oh, I want to be plastic free. Well, there's 2 plastic free oranges, you know. And these things are important. But if the bigger rules aren't there to support people to be plastic free or to support people to like use their keep cups or whatever, it is exhausting and it's actually mentally draining. And the impact that you have is not that big. I mean, if we are still drilling fossil fuels and pulling them out of the ground, the impact of using your keep cup is important. It is important. But it's a drop in the ocean. And so I think it's really important to find this, what I say is I do individual environmental actions until the moments that I start to feel guilty for not doing it. So I will do my best. But if I go to the supermarket and I have this like wave of guilt that I'm killing the planet because I haven't brought my, you know, reusable bag, then I'm going to say, look, hold on now a second. Let's look at the bigger picture here. One of the these classic, very annoying things. So we have a plastic bag tax in Ireland, as we know. I think it's 15 cents now for a plastic bag. But, and this kind of feeds back to what you're saying about big corporate interests. If you buy a bag for life, you know, those kind of more long-term, none of that taxes, that's not under the plastic bag tax. So you spend an extra euro on like, oh yeah, like I'm going to buy this reusable bag and it's great. And you think, okay, I'm giving my 15 cents to the government, to their environmental tax, and that's nice maybe. But actually that whole euro is going straight to Tesco's. And those bags actually aren't that long term. So I suppose it's just really important to do what you can, because I do also think that you use your keep cup and someone goes, keep cup, why are you using a keep cup? Like it does allow you to bring people on a journey. So I would never say don't make an effort. I would never say don't do the individual actions. But what I would say is never get guilty because you're not doing the individual actions. If you can't, remember that the rules are wrong and try and figure out how do we advocate for the rules to be better? How do we advocate for the rules to facilitate us to live in a world where everything isn't throwaway? And where it's normal to bring your cup. And if you don't bring your cup, that's fine, because maybe, you know, like and where we have, you know, less fossil fuels being drilled out of the ground. It is super complicated, but the key thing is don't be guilty. And a lot of government rhetoric is around individual actions and making people feel guilty for not doing individual actions, and saying, like, a lot of the stuff that we would hear from government in the last few years is, but people don't want this. Like, if people wanted this, if people wanted us to make change, they'd tell us. If people wanted us to make change, they'd all be using keep cups already. Well, keep cups are €15. Like, maybe you can't afford a fucking keep cup, you know? But they use that rhetoric to make people feel guilty for not doing it, to make it seem like it's your fault that climate change is happening. It is not your fault that climate change is happening. It's Shell and Exxon who knew, you know, in 1975 that drilling out of the ocean was going to cause climate change. It's not your fault, but you can do your best because that's the situation that we're in, and you can see where you can advocate for the rules to be better, and for us to stop certain industries.
Like, so glad that we're having this conversation now, for the very simple fact that like it's kind of resonating with a lot of things that I had in my head, just from a personal point of view about like, and you know, like at the house, like we make the effort to have as little waste as possible and do the recycling and stuff like that, and the things that kind of the balance between the bigger pictures and the smaller pictures, I kind of got over the last number of years, and I kind of really got the sense that, and this is just from a personal opinion point of view more than anything else, that the whole drive towards, like for example, like the keep cup, to use that example, in a way, like it's kind of, if it is true, like it's a very convenient way to distract people and put the blame back on individuals for the fact that like you're making people feel guilty that they're destroying the world because they're not using the reusable bag. But then the other thing that I was thinking before is like how many paper cups, like, and this is just me like daydreaming, thinking when I was sitting drinking a cup of coffee out of a keep cup one day, I was like, how many paper cups, the energy that it takes to make a paper cup, like how many paper cups worth of energy are there to make one keep cup? Because like a keep cup's like, it's not really for life. You're going to throw it away after a year or two anyway, probably, or it's going to break or something. Is there a thing there where like,
I actually have a colleague who works on an anti-plastic campaign called Sick of Plastic, and it's a pretty cool campaign because it links fossil fuels all the way to from when they drilled it out of the ground, made into plastic, and then end up in the ocean. And she'd be able to give you better stats on this. I do think that the energy, it do, like key cups do make sense. Basically, they are better for the environment than now. Again, things are changing now. There's more compostable cups. Paper cups used to be lined with plastic. They're less likely to be like that anymore. Things are changing a bit. The keep cup is definitely better. But again, you know, it does come down to, can you afford it? You know, is it fair to be stigmatizing people if they can't afford a keep cup? You know, there's all these other different factors, I think, that come into it, around what's fair to ask people to do, and what can people afford to do, and is environmentalism just turning into this like, yeah, it's so nice, like I can afford my keep cup and I go to my nice coffee shop and I'm doing my bit for the environment and that's great, and I don't use a paper cup and I'm fab. And I mean, that's not fair to people who maybe can't afford to do that. And it becomes two things. It becomes a trend, which is environment, like trying to save the planet is not a trend. It's something that we have to do. And it also becomes I think it's very easy for people to be disillusioned. Like you're sitting there going, well, is this actually worth, like, is my keep cup actually worth the paper cups that I'm giving up? And I actually personally, Áine personally, I don't think that coffee tastes as good out of a keep cup as it does out of a paper cup, you know. But people do get disillusioned because, like, well, the planet's still burning, you know, and I've used my keep cup all year. What the hell? This isn't fair. So, and then I think you can get bogged down. You can get pulled into trying to figure out, is this keep cup, you know, if I used 10 plastic cups, would that be the same as a keep cup? And like, bigger picture, you know, your keep cup is great, but it's not saving the planet. What's going to save the planet is stopping big corporations drilling, is stopping overconsumption, is stopping is reducing our use of energy, is reducing our use of fossil fuels. That kind of
aside from the battle to help more positive change for the climate, like there's an inherent value in not having a lot of waste in your life and not having a lot of like overconsumption, like you say, just from a personal point of view, that it's just much less of a personal burden and a personal trail behind, which I think it's kind of like, I suppose that's kind of the way that I kind of rationale my own efforts to have less waste, or to get things that are going to be able to use way more often than the things that are just one time use and throw them away, is more like, well, it just feels better. Yeah, and therefore that has benefits in and of itself.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's if something feels good to you, like, you know, and in that kind of respect, like, do it. Like, I often think of, like, you know, so many people are obsessed with like Marie Kondo and like this like minimalistic space and this like clean, like that's part of this, is this like, you know, reducing our consumption is so important, and reducing it in a way, you know, and again, environmentalists always get pitted against, you know, okay, so you just want no one to buy anything, you want no one to have any fun, we're all going to wear hemp and go live in a cave. Like, well, no. You know, you can reduce your consumption and actually have a lovely life. Like, you can have a great time. And I think, you know, if we look at, now, again, being very careful to not say that coronavirus has been a positive, but I think for a lot of people, slowing down, and people are starting to do a lot of creative stuff and stuff that doesn't necessarily produce waste and and consuming a bit less. And I think a lot of people that I've been talking to are slightly more, maybe not happier, but maybe more a bit at peace. And it's that kind of thing of like, what are the things that we're doing that are bringing us some kind of peace and joy, and what are the things that we're doing us, and are they actually helpful, like overconsumption, you know, wasteful behaviors and things, are we actually happy doing them? I think it's just interesting. I don't know, obviously, like we need to like look back at this time, but I think it'll be interesting to see what has made people feel like, what good things have people found for themselves that come out of this.
Like personally, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead. Yeah,
personally, I found that, like, just to touch on what you were mentioning there about like slowing down and stuff, is that I've had way more time inside the house, and therefore have noticed things that have been lying around, or things that have just kind of been accumulating, and been able to just kind of like get rid of some stuff, or hand some stuff off, or throw it away, or whatever, that stuff that was just sitting there like rubbish or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think maybe like, and I think if there's one thing that even from doing the podcast with people, I've been doing maybe 2 of them each week since we started the lockdown, is everyone is in a different situation basically. Like with the lockdown, people some people are living on their own, some people are with families, and some people are looking after other people. But I think that from a personal point of view, having more time is definitely something that gave me more opportunity to be kind of more aware or something like that. So that awareness then transfers over to kind of try to be more positive, to take more positive kind of personal actions for the environment, I guess.
Yeah, and I think another thing about this kind of time as well is like a lot of what we would talk about environmentalism is what are the things that we do that are low emissions? Like, how do we reorientate our society and our economies to like low emission work? And one of those big things is care work. And we've seen how important care work is during this time, and how we should be valuing care work and the work, and that's a very low emissions job. And so it's thinking about like, where in society are we putting our values? You know, where in society are we thinking about the value that we're creating and the value? So, you know, we're seeing how important it is for artists, how important it is for, you know, singer songwriters, that kind of like, that's fueling us, that's bringing us through this pandemic. Artists are bringing us through. They're usually quite low emissions. Carers are bringing us through this pandemic. Like, what is it that we need? What is it that like fulfills us? Actually, most of the time, it's that kind of like low emissions work. And it's just, you know, interesting to think about. I mean, there's lots of people who've written about this kind of stuff. I'd say Kate Raworth, Donut Economics, is a great one to think about, is, you know, what's fair and what's within our planetary boundaries, what's good for people and what's within our planetary boundaries when we think about economics. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff to kind of like sit and think about from what we've experienced in this time.
You've definitely noticed that thing with where the carers and the nurses and people who are working in hospitals, who a lot of the time have fought for better working conditions and better money, have been they're the people who are keeping society together, like the people who work in shops and stuff as well. Like
exactly. Yeah.
If you have time, I'd love to ask you about the stuff that you're doing with fashion.
Yeah.
So what kind of work are you doing in that area at the minute?
So, I work like I do basically this group that I'm involved in, the model activist group, is a group of different models from across the world who look at like lots of various aspects of sustainability within the fashion industry. But one of, and I kind of pop in and out of them, but one of the big things that they look at is they look at sustainability and workers' rights across the entire fashion chain. So across from workers who are actually making the garments all the way up to models who are like wearing the garments, and the rights and sustainability of like models as workers. And it's really interesting. So, I mean, one of the key things is, you know, if you're looking at factories where garments are being made, like it's very, very polluting. There's lots of dyes that go into rivers, go into people's lungs. Their workers' rights are usually quite bad. So long hours, cramped factories. And one of the things that we've seen with coronavirus is this and that one of the things that model activist community has been working on is this, a lot of the big companies like Pennies, H&M, Zara, basically initially just had done lots of orders to particularly Bangladesh, the vast majority of its economy is based on making clothes. And so they had loads of orders in, and they just, as soon as coronavirus came, they stopped them. And they're like, no, we're not paying you. Now, a lot of because of pressure, a lot of the companies have now paid, even though those orders won't be fulfilled and those clothes won't be made by the workers, they actually have paid the workers. But the power of these like large multinational companies clothing companies is so big that they were able, and it was billions of dollars. And so some of the work that we would do would be like purely based on that kind of like workers' rights perspective. And then also looking at, well, how do we advocate for clothes to be made in a more sustainable way? And again, fashion, I would say, is like it's like art. Like the clothes you wear are really important. But how do we, you know, we're in this like massive fast fashion space where people just buy clothes and then get rid of them. Like I know people who buy clothes, wear them once, throw them in the bin, and like that's just, it comes back to the same thing. Like it's, as I talked about at the start, it's crazy. You know, there's someone who's like in Bangladesh, or you know, if you're in the US, a lot of clothes are made in Miami, and they've made them. They've spent hours making them. They've been paid shite money. Sorry, probably shouldn't curse, but and then you buy it once for, you know, tenner, and then you throw it in the bin. I mean, it's just crazy. So trying to change that narrative, and it is so difficult because the fashion industry is so embedded. Like I always love that. You know, people say to me like, I mean, I don't know much about the fashion industry. I don't care about fashion. I don't care about what I wear. And there's that great piece in The Devil Wears Prada where Miranda Priestley says, well, you don't realize, but you know, I don't know, do you know the scene I'm talking about where she... So it's worth looking up. Basically, she says, you think that you're just like, you're wearing a jersey. No, that's probably a bit different. I'm wearing this green top. You think that you didn't give a crap. You think that you picked that up in a charity shop and it has nothing got to do with, you just picked it up. But actually, you know, in 2008, that was the fabric that was most in vogue at the time. And then, you know, Jean-Paul Gaultier made these dresses out of this, and then, you know, you follow it along, and basically, you know, H&M then made that version of it because that was the, you know, and basically just saying like the people at the top of fashion have so much influence on what we are wearing at any point, and what we wear is a reflection generally of, like, even if you don't think it matters, it does reflect on how you feel and who you think you are. And so a lot of the work that, like, it's basically saying fashion is important because fashion can be wonderful and people can really enjoy it. But how do we make sure that it's fair? How do we make sure that workers' rights are, how do we make sure that it's environmentally friendly as much as possible? It's the second biggest polluting industry in the world, fashion. So how do we make sure that it's environmentally friendly? How do we pull ourselves away from this like mass consumption of fast fashion? And one of the interesting things that people might not know is that fast fashion, which is your H&M, your Pennies, basically they just churn out clothes so fast. So they're, you know, there's clothes are in for 2 weeks and then they've got a new range. And that has a huge impact on the high fashion designers, who are these like supremely creative people. And, you know, like years ago, it would have been that you had 2-3 seasons a year. So they would spend 6 months creating their spring summer collection, and then they'd put their spring summer collection on the runways, and I'd be like, wow, it's amazing. And then they'd spend 6 more months creating their autumn winter collection. And now, because of fast fashion, these like very creative designers, and like, yes, granted, like, it's too much money for clothes. I completely agree. I think it's crazy. I would never buy I've never bought one piece of like high designer wear, even though I've worn it. But what they make is creative. But now what they've been forced to do because of fast fashion is now they're making spring summer, and then a month later they're doing, you know, a cruise collection, and then a month later they're doing a resort collection, and then pre-fall, and then pre-spring summer. And it's just they're starting to have to like lose their creative space and starting to churn this stuff out, which also means that they're not able to focus on as much probably on the environmental impacts. They're not able to as much focus on the rights of the people who are making these clothes for them. And so it's just kind of this like slowing down of fashion. That's really important. And then looking at the environmental impact of all this fashion. So flying people around the world to do shoots, it's just this global industry, which is supremely damaging, but is also supremely creative and very beautiful. And so, that's just a lot of the work we do is, trying to figure out how do you square that circle of creativity and sustainability.
The food industry, like, it seems like it kind of has a bit of quite some parallels with, the fashion industry and the food industry seem to have quite a lot of parallels in that, like, in say the Western cities and countries here, like that we create a massive demand for really cheap produce, and then that just has a knock-on effect that everyone else along the line is getting exploited except for the person who's getting the profit at the end of the day. Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the big issues with both within the food industry and within the fashion industry is, you know, a lot. And again, this kind of comes back to this like individual action which doesn't always work, because a lot of people would say, well, you know what, I'm just going to spend money. I don't want to exploit someone in Bangladesh, or I don't want to buy cheap avocados from Colombia, so I'm going to spend money just buying local or just buying, you know, Irish made clothes. And that's great, but the problem is that how fair is it for us to have, you know, got into these obviously not us personally, but our corporations and our systems have gone into these countries and basically meant that their whole market, their whole economy is based on export, whether it's exporting mangoes or exporting, you know, pennies clothes. And then for us to say, actually, do you know what? We've just realized that that's very bad. That's very bad for the environment. It's very bad for workers. So I'm not going to buy any of these things anymore. And so we're entangled in this system where you don't want to pull out of these markets because you don't want to leave these people with no economies. So it's a really complicated thing, and it's a slow process where we really have to be gentle. And I think this also like comes back to the thing I was talking earlier about climate finance, which is similar, which is like, you know, we've kind of made a big massive mess and we've got to help clean that mess up. So we've got to start, and the way we do that is to give most, like in fashion and food it's a bit more complicated, but like support those countries and give them money that just says, look, we know we messed up, we're sorry, here, like how can we support you to get out of this? And you decide it, like there's no strings attached. You guys figure this out. But yeah, the food system is exactly the same. And it is important to at the same time, you know, food sovereignty, growing local, doing local things is also so important for climate. So, you know, we've got ourselves into a mess. It opens up another question that you kind of alluded to earlier on in the chat, was that if we all do decide to only buy Irish clothes, like those clothes are going to be way more expensive than the clothes that we're able to buy in the town at the minute. And then it's kind of becomes that, like, it becomes the preserve of people who have got a lot of expendable income, in the same way that in some respects being able to buy organic food is a privilege that most people in Ireland probably aren't able to afford to do if they're trying to feed their whole family with organic food or whatever. And then, like, when I think about that, it's just mind-boggling, because then you're talking about, like, what's going to happen to change that is, like, move away from this whole model of society that we have completely. It's just like, and, like, I had this in my mind to ask you anyway before we even got on the call, but I definitely want to ask it to you now. Is, you know, the way that you're dealing with these issues, even some of the stuff, I know there's some of the stuff that we haven't even touched on during this chat, but like the global climate, the national issues, the fashion, and like yourself as a consumer in the same way that we're all consumers. How do you not crack up completely thinking about this, because they're all such big, massive things?
It's a process. I would say there's peaks and troughs. I think sometimes I just switch off. Sometimes, like, when you're working on this stuff day to day, sometimes you just have to go, I'm just trucking away. I know what I need to do, and you don't think about the bigger picture. Sometimes things just come and like smack you in the face. So like one of my very good friends was in Australia during the fires, and I had been like trucking along, not thinking much about climate change, working on it, but keeping going. And then she just would be, you know, just telling me about like how difficult it was during the Australian fires. And I was like, oh my God, the world is actually burning. Like, the world is actually burning. And that can really put you in a bit of a funk. But I suppose the thing is that keeps me going is having a lot of friends who care so much and who are working so hard on this. And also, you know, there's a great thing called Active Hope, which is, there's an Active Hope network in Ireland, and they're very focused on this. They do trainings and things for people in the workshops and things, which is very focused on sitting there and just accepting that this is where we are. This is where we are. We can't change what happened in the past. We can't change that people didn't act fast enough. But what we can do is we can sit and think about that so many people are working so hard to change things, and change is happening. Like, if you actually sit back for a second, even the last couple of years, like the change that has come about, you know, we had our like Taoiseach stand up in the UN and say that we're banning oil licenses in Ireland. Now, backtracked a bit on that afterwards. My God, you couldn't have imagined that happening a couple of years ago. So it's really kind of like, when that happens, like really pulling back and being like, no, actually change is happening, and it's maybe not happening as fast as we want, but it is happening. And then just knowing, like, I've just so many friends who work really hard on these kind of issues, and also people who, you know, may not be working on environmental issues, but are working in community building, or are working in care work, or are working in where all these things start to, like, or in unions and things, and all these things start to come together, and you can just see so many people really, really working to change the world, even against all the odds. And it's that thing, it's like, even against all the odds, people keep working, and people historically have kept working. I mean, you know, in the 70s, there was people doing this work, and people are still doing this work. This means that this stuff is worth it. It means that, like, there's a great, I'd recommend anyone to read this article by Mary Hegler, which is called the greatest of these is love. And basically she says, look, there is a love for this planet, and there's a love for the people on this planet that is like fiery and can be beautiful at sometimes, and sometimes can just be full of rage. But basically we're rooted in like love and a want for things to be better, and a knowing that things will be better. And sometimes you have days where you are exhausted and you don't want to do anything, and you do feel despair. But it's that thing. It's like, it's rooted in a love for people, and it's rooted in a love for the planet. And it's also rooted in the knowledge that, like, lots of other people are feeling that way too, and lots of other people, in whatever way they can, are like, I often think of GAA teams. when I get a bit sad, I think of how great GAA teams are, and how great, like, the community of GAA in Ireland is, and how, like, people look out for each other and people work together, and, like, you know, lads can, like, bait each other on the pitch and then afterwards go for a pint. And for me, that's that's the kind of like world that we're trying to look at. Like that's what we're trying to do. Like the whole feckin' world was like one big inter-county championship, inter-club county championships would be great. Like, you know, so it's that kind of thing, knowing that those things are out there. That's what kind of keeps me going. Like, yeah.
When I think about, like, we have a project that we were involved in setting up out in Palestine, and when I think about the sort of the times when I'm feeling a little bit down in relation to the work that we're doing or the stuff that's happening out there, it's like in direct proportion to how active I can physically be in the thing. Like when we were in Palestine, it's like you're running around and you're meeting people and talking to people, and even though like you could be in the middle of an absolute shit show out there or whatever, but at least you're active. And then so then it's just like you're kind of going around and you're kind of like in the field as such. And then the next level down for me then is if I was doing a podcast with somebody, we're talking to them and then you're kind of like cool, and then but then afterwards I can be like, oh geez, that's pretty depressing actually. And then when I'm editing the podcast is when it's really worst, because you're not actually doing anything, you're not having a conversation, you're just listening to it over and over, or if you're working on the computer. And there's definitely times when it can play on your mental health, because you're involved in something that's completely way bigger, a zillion times bigger than any one person or any group really. Like, but I was actually listening to a lecture that Angela Davis gave it was in Barcelona. I was just watched it on YouTube, but somebody actually asked her how, Angela Davis must be like 70 odd years old now or something like that, and someone asked her, how can you keep struggling all the time, like how are you able to keep going? And because the girl who asked it was like, because we have this group and like sometimes we can't even get out of bed because we're just faced with this enormous challenge, and sometimes we're good at struggling and sometimes we just can't even face it. And she was just kind of saying, well, you need to be able to look after yourself. Like she was like, I do yoga and I go for hikes, and that's how she kind of maintained her ability to keep going back to the well and like keeping her fight going or whatever for the stuff that she believes in.
Yeah, I think a book I read recently called Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown. And I love Adrienne Maree Brown. She's like this thinker from the US and she's amazing. But one of her things is saying that like, if we're trying to create this better world, really what we want is things to be enjoyable, like not in a hedonistic way, not in like we should be able to like spend loads of money and like, you know, it's about like, what are the little things we do every day that give us pleasure? And if you're doing those things, and if you're doing those with other people, with a view that like actually doing things that make us happy, that give us pleasure, is almost changing the world. Because, you know, a lot of the world that we live in now, it's like, go to work, feel a bit sad, you know, keep going, feel a bit guilty for not taking action on climate change, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, what boring fucking world is that, you know? So doing like, even if you're saying, look, today I can't face the big issues, but you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the park and I'm going to play football with my friend, or I'm going to do some painting. I'm going to do something that is low impact but like pleasurable. And if you can show that to other people, and the more people that are doing that, and like taking time to rest is so important. Like rest is something that is not valued in our society, and rest is something that's pretty low impact, you know. Taking time to rest, taking time to look after each other, taking time to care, taking time to enjoy ourselves in these kind of like really in these ways that are natural to us. And I think this comes down to a lot of the learnings that we've all had sitting at home, is so important. And that, like, you know, if you're, you know, that's also changing the world. It's not going to change the world immediately, but it's about, like, a lot of changing the world is about changing mindsets as well. And also acknowledging that, you know, the other side of that is like, if you're editing a podcast, like, yeah, it's grunt work, and it's shit at the time. But that work is also super valuable because you're doing work to try and get these ideas to other people. So I think, yeah, it's all about like the big flashy stuff is important, but the little bits are so important too, and acknowledging that.
I think that what you said there is kind of a really powerful idea, that idea of doing things that you enjoy doing and that things that are creative and stuff like that there, because it's the direct opposite to what's probably the core of the problem with many of the issues that we've talked about, which has been like the fact that profit is the king.
Yeah.
And the opposite of that is doing something that's not for profit, that's for fun and for enjoyment, and like that brings you outside and gets around with other people. And really, like, if the fight is against all the negative stuff that comes from the fact that people are being exploited, then it's like one of the most definite things that you can do in opposition to that is to do stuff that's for enjoyment and for fun and with other people and creative and stuff like that there. So
yeah, exactly. And then that gives you energy to go and do the big hardcore, tackle the big issues as well, you know, so it's a win-win.
That's probably a good place to finish up. So thanks a million for taking the time to chat and share your ideas and the work that you're doing.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
This is chapter 6 of the book that we're reading together at the minute, The Last of the Name by Charles McGlinchey. The first chapter is at the end of episode 67, and this chapter is called Emigration. Every chapter is kind of a recounting of life in Donegal between the 1800s basically and the mid 1900s, when Charles McGlinchey was alive, and he's remembering things from his own time and from his parents' and his grandparents' time as well. It's actually a class book. It's quite a small book, but there's about 15 chapters in it, and this is chapter 6. And it's a harder book to read than most, like reading it out loud. It's definitely more of a challenge to read than the Roald Dahl book that we read together before we started off on this one. And I think it's just because it's written kind of as it was said, if you know what I mean. Brian Friel edited the book to make it kind of in book format or whatever, but it's still very much kind of conversational. But I'm enjoying reading it, and I hope you are too. So if you want to go back to the first chapter, it's at the very end of episode 67 of the podcast. And as I was saying, this is chapter 6, and it's called Emigration. In my father's time, any man or young fellow who hadn't much to do at home in the summer went to the harvest in England or Scotland, to the shearing. My father never left home. He had his trade as a weaver and had plenty of time. He had plenty to do at home. When he would hear of the good wages, up to maybe £1 a week, that were to be made across the water, he always quoted a saying that the old people had: "Ha mi'n mill ar yohadan, na ar grasuga ijir ha'ela achirid is a tasawala." There is no honey on thistles, nor gold on briars in any other countries, any more than at home. The shearing in his time is done with the toothed hook, and men going to Scotland often took their own hooks with them, hooks that they were used to working with. They were paid by the acre. The pay was 15 shillings an acre with their keep. They slept in the barn on the bed of straw with a blanket over them. They were out in the morning early on a fasting stomach and got oaten porridge and milk taken out to them at breakfast time. For their dinner, they got a bottle of beer and a shearer's loaf. No butter, not even a knife. They just broke off pieces and ate it that way. They had porridge and milk again in the evening, and that was the day's feeding. But they could do a great day's work all the same. Now it takes all the men of the parish 2 or 3 starts of an afternoon to cut the grass in the graveyards, what one good shearer could do in a day or 2 before this. Before they earned the 15 shillings, the corn had to be tied and stooked. Every man would have the bulk of £5 or maybe £10 home with them after the harvest, and that would come in handy for the rent that had to be paid in October and the cuts or the rates that were due at holiday. The rents ranged from £6 to £10 or so, and the cuts were about half of that. It took a lot of gathering at the prices things were going, and wages at 9p a day. The boat fare to Scotland was 4 shillings, but when the Dug deal was running, they cut the prices, and I heard Paddy Moore McElhenney saying that he got over and back on the Dug deal for 6p a time, and got a bottle of porter into the bargain. After the wars were over in 1815, lots of ones went off to America. It was all sailing vessels at the time. One of the Grants of Clough went to America, and it took him 3 months. On the way over, he got so seasick that the crew were for throwing him overboard because he was about dead. They had a sheet of canvas spread out to roll him up in, but some Malin men interfered and wouldn't let them throw him overboard as long as there was life in him. He lasted out the voyage and reached Philadelphia. Instead of taking work, he got a pack and soon made the price of a house. And before he died, he had a street of houses and left all to a daughter of his by the name of Gormley. At that time, it cost £1 to send a letter to America. That was before there was any post office here. The letter had to be left in a house in Derry and would be sent on some ship to Boston or wherever it was going. It would lie there till the person it was for came to lift it. I remember myself the time the post office wasn't straight, when the people had to go there for their letters. There was no delivery like there is now. I heard too of a man called Owen McCreven, who went to America in the old days, but with the storms and contrary winds, didn't it take him half a year to make the journey. Nearly all their provisions was used up. Owen had a good store of tobacco with him, and the captain gave him a gold sovereign for a small bit he had left. The captain's supply must have run short. It was a common thing for ship to be lost at sea. They were wooden ships with sails and couldn't stand up to the storm. In my grandfather's time, in 1811, the year before he was pressed into the navy, there was a ship sunk off Dunaff Head. Big Thomas Carey of Owenbuy remembered the night well, when wind shifted round and drove the ship onto the rocks. She sank a short distance from the shore, and the mast could be seen at low water for long after. The ship was called the Saldanha, and there was a song made about her. People say if she had kept out to the depths, she would have stood a better chance, but the captain said he'd make Loch Swilly or hell of it before the morning. In Desert Agni, that night, a strange woman came into a house and sat by the fire and spoke to nobody. At midnight, she jumped up and shouted, "The Saldanha's down." She made out the door and was never seen again. The morning after the ship was lost, a parrot was found in the trees above Fahan, one that must have come off the Saldanha. All the parrot could say was, "Poor Saldanha, poor Saldanha." A neighbour of ours, Paddy Moore Harkin, had 7 sons, and they all went abroad in their time, except one who stayed in the home place. In 1841, when the land was first cut up, Paddy Moore lost a good bit of ground he had and his father before him. They were given a bare bit of heathery ground and lived under a rock till they got a sod house built for themselves. The bailiffs got their pick of the good land, and in those days, if you met a bailiff and didn't touch your cap, you'd find yourself out of your farm or maybe in jail. That year the Harkins had to get a ridge for potatoes in Gortfad and one in Carrow Hill till they got some of the heather broken in. One of Paddy's sons, John, was so angry that he packed up and went to Scotland, but died in a hospital there soon after. As the sons grew up, they went to America. Charlie was the 7th son. The old people would tell you there was a cure for the evil on the 7th son. Charlie never worked at the curing, but Ono Breslin used to call him the doctor, and he wasn't half pleased about it. He was a fine strapping fellow. He could stand on the doorstep at thatching time and throw a kirchlein or a queue of homemade straw ropes over the rope without touching the hatch. It would weigh 3 stone, good, or maybe more. He spent a lot of his time out with the dogs and gun, and had 7 foxes' skins in the house at the one time. One day, he was footing turf on the bank. He took a cramp and was only able to make home of it. They got a doctor from Derry, and he tried leeches to his side, but they did him no good. Then he said there was a medicine in Derry that would cure him, but he would need to get it inside 4 hours. So a friend of Charlie's, Johnny McDade, saddled his horse on the street at 10 o'clock. It was a moonlit night in June. He galloped the 25 miles to Derry and back again and jumped off his horse on the street as the clock in the room was striking 2. The horse was in a layer of sweat, and they turned him down to the garden. He lay down and stretched out his legs and head from him and lay that way till sundown the next evening. Then he got up and shook himself and started to nibble the grass. The medicine did Charlie no good, and he died 2 days after. His 2 dogs hung about the house and would go with nobody else. Both of them were dead in a fortnight's time. They paid the doctor £5. He was a Dr. White. Mickey and Dennis, 2 other sons of Paddy Moore's, went to England for a year or 2 and then went to America. It took Mickey 3 weeks and 3 days one time going to the English harvest. He got work on a farm there, and next morning the man of the house took out a pot of porridge to the field for the breakfast. There was a hole in the porridge for each man, with milk and a spoon in it. Mickey stood with his back to a tree, so the boss came back and asked why he wasn't eating. Mickey said he wanted his food right and that he wasn't reared that way, so he was taken inside and got his meals at the table from that on. Mickey always wore a white ball hat made of a sort of rubber or gutta percha. They were called ball hats. Next year his brother Dennis went over to the same farmhouse, and when the farmer got his name, he called to the wife, "Here's a brother of white hats. He'll have to get his meals in the house." Dennis went to America about the year 1850. It took the ship 7 weeks and 3 days to cross over. The sailing vessels would have to take down sails if a storm got up, and they would often be blown back in one day what they went forward in 3 days. The vessel had provisions of some kind on board, but everyone took a supply of oaten bread as well with them. The whole townland would be baking and hardening oaten bread for whoever was going away. They were baking for a fortnight beforehand. The bread would be hardened 2 or 3 times till you could walk on it. All the bread was packed in a small barrel that the coopers made for that purpose, and everyone going to America had his barrel. They used to get a batalcha, an armful of straw, a Derry K, and a bag of biscuits for $1. That was how the O'Kanes made their money first, selling straw and biscuits at Derry K, before they got into the whiskey trade. The straw was for sleeping on during the voyage. Dennis Harkin made a lot of money in Boston, but in 1857 he went to try his luck in California. At that time the journey had to be done by sea round South America. He had 2 companions with him by the name of Ward from the backcountry, and the 3 of them stayed at some hotel in California. One night Dennis was attacked in bed and his throat cut, but he held the men and raised the alarm. When help came, who was it but the 2 Wards? There was a 3rd man, but he escaped out a window. Dennis lived for 4 days and wrote a letter home, sitting up in his bed. The Wards were arrested, and the sheriff of the place said he would give Dennis the privilege of inflicting whatever punishment he wished on the 2 of them. Dennis said he was going where he'd be looking for forgiveness for himself and to let them go. All during my time, people kept going to America, and there's not a family in the parish but has somebody belonging to them in the States. There was always a big night for anybody going away. Neely McColgan, the blind fiddler, would be sent for, and they would dance till day clearing. Then, too, for anyone coming home, there was always a bottle drink, but these led to so much drinking that Father Fox put the bottle drinks down entirely. Most of them all got on well in the States. A relation of my mother's, the name of Diver from Urus, went out before my time, and sure a grandson of his was made governor of the state of Massachusetts in 1948. Times at home were bad, and they left home with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The old people always said that good health and the grace of God were fortune enough for any young man or young woman.